Everyone. Welcome to our first Blueprint developer and designer collaboration workshop. And we're very excited to host this workshop for today. It's our first time ever doing something like this. And we just hope that we give you enough information and insightful information about what it takes to collaborate with the different aspects of creating a product and what it means to be more open-ended and becoming more able to listen to the other side of the entire development process. So for the quick introductions, hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a VP of Design for Blueprint, and I'm very excited to present this workshop for you all today.
Hi, my name is, hello, my name is Siddharth Nandi. I'm the VP of Technology here at LA Blueprint. And yeah, I'm excited to present with Sarah. Oh, by the way, there are cookies up in the front if you would like to take any. There's like one that isn't like contaminated with peanuts and stuff like that. And there's one that's just like a variety pack that may have peanuts and stuff, depending on your allergies. But yeah.
So just to quickly go over the agenda, we'll be talking about the planning stage of the app, going over the initial research, what it takes to research the background of the apps that you'll be creating, or the users, or the potential competitors. And after that, I'll be going over some nailing down basic features about the scope and the basic feasibility of what it takes to create an app. And then he will go over the technical parts of technical design. And after that, we'll be going over design and development, essentially talking about the collaboration aspect of design and development. And lastly, how we put that into practice. And essentially, hackathons are coming up. So we'll be wanting to give you some tips and tricks on how to really nail all this information into this short time of hackathons. So first, planning the app. So for apps, we will first need to determine who the target audience is. Target audiences is essentially the users who will be using the app regularly, not only the ones who will be administrating and creating the app, but the ones who will actually use it every day. And then whenever they're interacting, they're the ones who are catered towards the app's purpose. And for example, this would be identifying who the target case is, who are the actual age range, or even the race, or even the diverse inclusions. And knowing this is very important because before we create the app's purpose, it is very important for us to understand the limitations behind who or what tech this relates to, and the design really compares into the target audience of what we're creating. And after, we needed to think about what is so special about this app, since there are so many different apps already in the market, and we need to understand this value proposition of what is so special and different compared to other apps out there. For example, in Blueprint, we created an app called Friends of the Children. And the features that we created were very similar to Google Drive and Notion and other different module apps, but the ones that we created are very different and more in a competitive landscape compared to the ones that we created before. So knowing what's so special about this app is very important for us to create and design before we start starting the project. And lastly, we need to understand what problem this is solving. Because it is a product development project, we need to understand what the pain points the users are experiencing. And usually this is found by doing user research or any certain kind of surveys that goes behind finding the app's purpose. So for initial research, a lot of the times initial research in product development is usually done by designers. But for example, in hackathon spaces or some kind of teams with no designers, developers are also the ones putting into the research practice. And it is also very helpful for developers to understand and know what kind of research goes behind understanding the users. So if you're a developer, is now your time to really know what goes behind the research. And firstly, a lot of designers conduct something called a competitive analysis. This is common to other industries as well, especially business industries, but essentially in product, we try to discover how competitors solve similar usability issues. For example, the most basic example could be Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music. Then these are all the similar competitors, and even though they're essentially doing the same thing, their features are very different, their use cases and user scenarios are very different. So understanding what kind of best features work for each app is very important for us. And then we can also conduct research about what their failures are and what we can do to avoid those mistakes. And then we can also do something called user research. There are different kinds of user research that I'll be going over later. And user research is very important for us to understand their behaviors, goals, and motivations, and what it really takes for us to choose our app and regularly interact with it every day. So just to go over the competitive analysis a little bit more deeply, you do something called a SWOT analysis. And SWOT analysis is essentially the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You would conduct a SWOT analysis for each competitor that you decide to conduct analysis with. And then oftentimes a lot of designers use the competitor's product. And for example, I would be using like a YouTube Music regularly for a week and then see if this is causing me any pain points and then jot down notes. And that'd be helpful for us to understand what the users are experiencing and also see what kind of problems they arise. And if you don't want to use a competitor's product, the other example that you could do is actually reading through the competitor's reviews. The App Store reviews are very helpful because they're the ones who are essentially using the apps every day and giving relatively good feedback. So a lot of designers usually go through App Store reviews and see what kind of problems that they can find and jot down everything into one collaborative sessions. And then user research is one of the most common and most essential parts of the product development cycle, because without user research, you wouldn't know what kind of problems you're trying to solve and what kind of behaviors or needs that you're trying to provide for them, and understand what kind of designs or even research are needed for this product development cases. And these are some of the examples of user research methods. And I'll just be going over some most important ones, which are usability testing, field studies, user interviews, A/B testing, and surveys. So essentially usability testing, which you can see it's on the qualitative scale. You are basically sitting beside the user when they're actually navigating your app, and you will be asking them, oh, is this feature usable? What kind of problem that you solve when you are actually using the app? And then you'll be getting insightful responses directly from them while they're actively using your features. And field studies are the ones that you're observing from their natural habitat. So for example, you have a client that you want to do a research on, then you would go to the actual client spaces and do research on behalf of the user, and then try to analyze what's going on in the background scene and understand what the users are going through on the spot. And user interviews are essentially like coffee chats with the users. And then you get to ask questions, stories, motivations, and why they chose to do certain actions. And user interviews are very important because you get to really talk one-on-one with them and then develop rapport and really understand what goes behind their thoughts. And A/B testing is very different from other research methods that I talked before. A/B testing is essentially you will provide two different design examples to them. And then for one side of the user, you will provide one design example, and the other side would be a different user design example. And you send out two different designs to each different user groups. And then you would see and analyze what kind of design works the best for the different users. And then you would decide between A and B side to see which design works the best. Yeah, and lastly, the user interviews, the ones that I told you about, the most important ones. This is just an example of how user interviews work. They can be conducted in person or on Zoom or even online through surveys. But I think the most helpful one that you do is on Zoom, because you get to really write out a script and understand and kind of plan out what kind of questions that you're anticipating, and then write down notes at the same time while you're interviewing them. And this is very helpful to understand what the users are thinking in the most direct way. And like an example would be providing lo-fi or mid-fi prototypes or mockups to them and asking them for feedback during this entire process. Yeah, and then also one of the most important things that in Blueprint especially that we go through is something called a scoping call. For project leads, both design and developer project leads go to a process called a scoping call with the NPO partners that we choose to interact with. And then after we decide on the NPOs, we discuss about their current approach, their target audience, important features, deadlines, and if they have a developer and staff. This process is very important for us because this gives an idea for us to understand what their scope is, and also if it's capable for us to finish within the time period that we have for about 8 or 7 months. And then for designers, at least, we get to really understand what kind of features are essentially necessary for us to ideate. And then with the developer project lead, the design project lead kind of talk about what kind of like meetings or discussions are needed to really make a team. And then this is very important for us to understand before we actually start on the project. And also the last point about the developer and staff is also very important because after we do a handoff and deploy our app to our nonprofit client, it is important for them to upkeep the project that we deliver to them and also keep on using the app. So it is important for us to know like who the IT managers are, if they have any developers or volunteers that they have on staff. And that's something that we really try to keep in mind before we choose NPOs partners. Yeah. And after the research, we basically have to nail down the features before we start creating the app. And some examples that we really have to consider are collaborative feature planning, avoiding ambitious overreach, and understanding the limits and expectations. So first, for collaborative feature planning, the first point that I want to bring out is user flow and interaction discussions. For user flow and interaction discussions, it is essentially engaging in discussions about the user flows and interaction during the feature planning phase. For this phase, it's important for both developers and designers to kind of understand what users are going through and what kind of interactions are needed when they're going through the app, because that determines what kind of features you'll be ideating and what kind of design decisions are being made and impacted through the user flow. And then the second point is continuous feedback loops. You have to establish continuous feedback loops within stakeholders and also with developers to designers, because this entire product development process is not just one decision, one decision, one decision. It is in continuous iterations and changes and asking for feedback from both stakeholders and developers, because even though you think that this one design might be catered towards this one user, it might not work for different users, and you cannot always represent all users at the same time. So it's important for us to understand that there will not be a definite answer to what design works the best, and there should be a continuous change and communication throughout the entire process. And also during this entire feedback loop process, make sure to have open communication, be open for feedback, and open to criticism as well. Yeah, and another thing is a realistic scope definition. So first, realistic scope definition, you need to really clearly define the project scope and avoid unnecessary features. This is kind of different whether you're some kind of context or background or whether what kind of apps or timeline that you're working with. But for example, in a Blueprint, if you have a certain product that you have to finish or deliver by the end of the school year, then you have to understand that you promised to deliver this product by, let's say, May or June. And then you need to understand what kind of timeline or time frame this project would work the best, and nail down or scale down to the limited amount of features that you can work the best with the developers and designers on hand. And this would essentially be called an MVP. And it's always best to over deliver a product, and you don't want to over promise certain features that you want to deliver to them. So making sure that the client side, they also understand the capabilities and scopes of the project is very important. Yeah, and also understanding limits and expectations is kind of going over what I've mentioned before. Some technical constraints are usually determined after talking to and communicating with the developers on the team. And you need to, for designers especially, you need to understand that there might be some challenges or problems that they may face, and some designs might have to be changed throughout the process. And on the developer side, that some designs might change after usability testing, and there should be a mutual understanding behind what kind of constraints or limitations that we have to set before we actually move on for the iterations process. And scalability is kind of related to the scope that I mentioned before. And scalability is usually saying that this project can be expanded in the future. And then, for example, if you have a certain product that you only have 3 features, but then you can maybe promise them that you can deliver to 5 more features that they want, or you could possibly finish by the end of the school year. But this is something that you can just consider, but not always have as your option. Yeah, and then I'll just be going over Figma really quickly, just to introduce why prototyping and having a clear file is very important for both developers and designers. Okay. Uh-oh. Okay, perfect. So this is just an example of what we call a design system for when we're creating a product. So this example over here is a design system that's created for a web app. And usually in web apps, you have a certain grid system before you actually start a project. And before handing off the final design to developers, it's very important for you to kind of have a standardized system for all types of design layouts that you may create. And that can be a grid, it can be indentation, it can be typography, color, and effects, or even iconography and buttons and everything else. It's very important for you to make this into components and have everything in one place and make sure that you're defining all the different elements of what you're choosing to design, because on the developer's point of view, it's very important for you to have every single resource that you find in one page, because let me show an example of a prototype screen. If you have something called, let's say, go to a high fidelity file, and you're kind of viewing as a developer, when you're basically seeing every single screen like this all at once, it can be very confusing. And if you have everything kind of highlighted out over here, different text styles and colors already there, it's easier and much more convenient for developers to find out what colors are needed for each different screens and understand the different text and body that goes into part of it. And also for, let's say, buttons, for example, because they are usually the ones that are most commonly used for each different screens, having the ones that you can always just change into components is very convenient when you're changing or iterating designs as well. So this is just an example of what you can create before you hand off the final designs to developers and also your client. And this is just an example that you may be able to create before you finalize your design process. And for prototyping, I just want to show you an example of how it works. Yeah, so in Figma, you do every single design elements through this above tab bars, and you can click this to start prototyping. So essentially, these arrows are the ones that are moving to different screens, and you can like move around different arrows that kind of goes to different screens. And let's say you click this button and then you move it here, and that means when you click this forgot password, then it'll move to different screens. And this one would be this screen. And when you see it all in like a zoomed out point of view, this can be very confusing, and it might be very confusing for developers to understand the interactions between different pages and see what kind of user flow is needed. So before you hand it off this entire process to the developers, I would recommend writing down notes or into a list of points of which start screens are the first and with which process it goes through before you actually hand off into these kind of messy arrows. Yeah, and that's basically what prototyping does in Figma. And yeah, I'll hand it off to Sid.
1 second. Yeah. No, we're good. Oh, that's not. Okay, that's fine. Well,
Um,
top left.
about
Oh,
yeah,
you're
yeah.
You're right. All right. Minor. Oh, that's FaceTime. Oh, shoot. Oh, that's okay. No, I'm trying to get it to full screen again, but it's okay. It is working. Perfectly fine. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'll get into a little bit later everything that devs can or maybe should or could do with regards to the research that designers do. But for now, let's talk a little bit about what devs are concerned with immediately. So obviously, like the technical design of your app is going to determine the ease with which your user can interact with it. And that goes like all the way from like the low level data stuff all the way to the actual interface that they're going to be interacting with. So just as a little bit of a primer, developing an application involves two core components. There's the front end, which is again the user interface, and handles all the user interactions with your app. And then of course there's the backend, which handles all the business logic, the connection with the database, and then also connecting back to the front end to make sure that user interactions do something meaningful. We split the development primarily to achieve a clear separation of concerns, but also we have like considerations for scalability, performance, security, and just having a more efficient development process to make sure things are just compartmentalized better. Yeah, so I guess starting off with database design, persisting data in like an organized manner is almost always necessary for an app that has like a very complex information architecture. So like we want to be able to store all our different kinds of data in an organized and scalable way. So for example, in a social media app, for example, I might want to store things about users in one table, social media posts, users, posts, etc. But yeah, so in approaching the actual design for this, we wanted to find data models for the different things that we are storing in our database. It helps the things that you see on the right are called ERD diagrams, entity relationship diagrams. You don't have to like get into what exactly is over there, but the idea is that we kind of want to map out how exactly different things relate to one another. So for example, if we have a social media, for example, I want to know that users have certain attributes like a name, an ID, and then we also know that users may own different posts or like they post their social media posts. So we'd have to link those kind of like models together. And so there are different kinds of databases as well. I won't get into too much of the weeds of what they are, but we have like NoSQL versus relational databases. When you look into these for your app, you kind of have to weigh like the needs of your app, the needs of your data. So for example, like NoSQL databases, they end up being, you have like a lot more flexible schemas versus relational databases. You have very strict definitions for the data that you're storing. And as a result, you can query things a lot more easier, but that might not be necessary for an app that you're building. Like, for example, like if you're building out like an app for like a financial system or like some kind of e-commerce, then you might need that sort of rigidity and some and fast queries that a relational database might be able to offer. But if you have like an app that deals with analytics or like a content management system or like again, like a social media app, things where the data ends up being a little more flexible, it might be easier to go with a NoSQL database, or it might be more wise to. And of course, you need to weigh your dev team's experience as well with it, because as with any project, like if your dev team is not like familiar with the tech stack that you're choosing, that's additional overhead that is put on your developers and yourself. All right. Next is of course the backend, and by that I mean just the connection between the database and your front end. So we can build out something called an API, or an application programming interface, which basically allows us to, again, let the users communicate with the database in a secure manner. So as part of the planning process, it's important to at least have a high-level understanding of how information flows between the user and the database. And so we wanted to find the scope and functionality of all the necessary interactions that users can engage in. So if I want like to get a profile screen, for example, I don't want to send everything I have about the user to my front end. I don't want to send like even an encrypted password, for example. So having a good idea, like having at least a high level understanding of like what I might want for different features can help us determine how we want to interact with our database through our backend specifically. Another thing on top of that would be to research middleware libraries. And by that, what do I mean? Middleware libraries like offer additional functionalities, can range from security to performance optimizations, could be error handling, anything as low as that. So for example, again, like if you have like a profile system for your app, you might benefit from having some authentication middleware to make sure that like random people who don't register with your app can't access sensitive data. And then finally, well, they're all equally important, but the front-end design is important for exactly what your users will see. And you end up asking yourselves the most questions in terms of how you choose your front-end framework. So for example, you would be asking, who are your users? And by that, I mean, what devices do they use? What kind of I guess interfaces are they most familiar with? You want to make sure that your platform caters to your users at the end of the day. Again, how much bandwidth do you have? Like I was alluding to earlier, your project will have, like any project that you build out will have a specific scope, and you don't want to be like, again, putting undue overhead on your developers, asking them to develop under a new framework. And yeah, you want to like consider the efficiency of developing under something familiar, or maybe if there's like something more innovative with a newer framework, that might be something that might be worth the cost. And then finally, what do your features need? Like some frameworks might have libraries that might have or might not have certain libraries that make or break whether you choose it or not. So like, for example, if you need like data visualizations, if you need like any third-party APIs like Google Maps or something, it might be useful to make those considerations ahead of time and determine exactly what framework might be appropriate for that. A good example from Blueprint specifically would be the Skid Row Arts Alliance app that we developed last year. A lot of our users were Android phone users, so intuitively you might think we would build out a Kotlin app or something that works natively with Android. But on the other hand, our developer onboarding process goes through teaching everyone JavaScript and React Native. So given the 2-quarter scope of our projects, it wouldn't make sense to switch frameworks just when React Native would suffice for like an Android user base, Android device user base. And yeah, other considerations that you might make are including like responsive design, like accessibility. Again, industry standard kind of depends on what you're doing with your app. Community support, you don't want like a very niche framework. And then finally, just having like seamless integration with the backend. And yeah, also finally, like it's okay to use your initial user flows and mockups with the designers that you work with to guide you on again the appropriate flow of data, what kind of screens and pages you need, and basically the framework should kind of like be compatible with like that envisioned data flow and the progression of user interactions. Yeah, okay. Next, we'll kind of talk about getting into the weeds of working between the teams. So yeah, so starting from the get-go, I guess, designers and developers almost necessarily work in like separate activities, if that makes sense. So like designers will focus on like user experience and interface design, whereas like developers will again focus on the architecture, the data models, choosing an appropriate tech stack, etc. And so while it's natural for designers and developers to focus on their like individual specialties, it's important to also have like good communication from the get-go. Because if you're like working like completely disjoint from each other, the visions of a project might also diverge, which may lead to complications later, like having to rework features, delaying your project timeline, and also like at the end of the day, just not meeting initial expectations because everything gets held up. Do we have enough time? Okay, we'll skip the question. So I had a question about like how do you think design and development teams can collaborate while planning an app to avoid such issues? So I'll solicit any audience responses now. All right, cool. No, it's okay. Let's see. So yeah, let's talk about what things designers and developers can work on. So again, designers themselves, I mean, they're concerned with feature ideation, but it's not something they need to be exclusively working. Like it's not something that only they should be exclusively working on. Having joint brainstorming sessions about this stuff encourages like again, like inherently has like diverse perspectives, and you can like consider like things down the line that developers may need to consider. Collaboration on the flow of information is also kind of important. So you might consider like having a shared understanding of like data movements will help designers understand exactly how, not exactly, but have a high level understanding of how developers need to kind of like determine, oh, what's stored in a database, what's stored on a front end, and that'll determine how like user flows and user interactions will work. Developers can participate in the user research itself, so that includes interviews and usability testing. Again, that's part of that rapid feedback loop that Sarah was alluding to before, in the sense that we want to make sure that developers can iterate quickly depending on how designs change. And so rather than working through like a pipeline where designers finish conducting interviews or usability testing and then deliver changes in a delayed sense, just picture a scenario where like developers are involved in that process and can, to the best of their ability, I suppose, code flexibly around what changes might be made along the way. And then again, designers can also review technical documentation, kind of alluding to what I was talking about earlier, wherein like they can provide potential insights into like how like the user experience implications about certain technical decisions. And then finally, of course, developers being included in the early prototyping stage can help like preempt any problems down the line about feasibility of certain designs and interactions. All right, and then finally, also, not finally, but next up, it would be diving into the actual work. So again, we want to make sure there's like consistent communication between designer and developer teams, even though, again, they almost necessarily work in silos. And so as, again, designers iterate on their work, developers need to be able to like be flexible to changes, wherein each team kind of adapts to the other, depending on feasibility, changes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we'll skip the question. But yeah, so I think some good ideas for having first facilitating that kind of communication over a long-term project would include design implementation reviews, making sure like designers making sure that developers are kind of following through with their mid-fis and high-fis, mid-fidelity and high-fidelity designs accordingly and appropriately. Code walkthroughs could help designers get a sense of the actual flow of information as developers implement it, and that could inform their own iteration. Collaboration on the design system, again, we'll talk about this later. Certain kinds of assets and icon libraries, for example, might be more, might be easier or more efficient for a developer to implement rather than designing everything from scratch. For example, like there's a library called Material UI that is more convenient for developers to use than, for example, downloading a bunch of SVGs that designers design when they end up doing the same purpose. Documented asset sharing, again, documentation would just be a matter of like technically and design documentation, making sure the design system's consistent. And finally, regular internal demos to basically allow each side of the team to get an understanding of what the other is doing. And again, have that kind of immediate feedback. And then, yeah, so, all right, this will be a little bit of a hypothetical scenario. So suppose you're, depending on who you are, you're one of a developer and a designer collaborating on a new feature for a task management system. It's a task management app. And specifically, the feature is you want to allow users to create and manage shared to-do lists. So after a designer shares, the designer being you or the person you're working with, your developer, shares their mid-fidelity designs with the developer, what kind of questions would a developer ask, or should a designer be prepared to answer regarding this new functionality? So consider you're just given like a design. What exactly would you think to ask first? Yeah.
Maybe I could begin the need task.
Yeah. So we want to obviously start with like the base functionality. So like creating things. We have creating and managing. Do we want to be able to delete tasks as well? Any other ideas? Yeah.
I think in general, it's like all the possible options and then also cases together.
Mhm. Exactly, yeah. The idea of edge cases being like, making sure that developers have an idea of exactly what users can and should not be able to do. Any other ideas?
It's like how the users are grouped, like where would the shared to-do list exist in like the apps space, like, is it like how you going through something like that? I think about like, what if there's too many users sharing the same list, like what's gonna happen? I don't know if that's something a designer also.
No, I mean, absolutely. I think like, again, it's in a collaborative platform, we need to make considerations about like how that it actually looks when multiple people are working at the same time. Yeah, I guess like other ideas would be like accessibility concerns, like things about the design system that are being implemented with the specific feature, other kinds of like more or less like common software development things like sorting and filtering, like how do we want to be able to see tasks? How do we want to be able to like, do we want to be able to like open them on a different screen, or do we just want to keep it all on one screen? Basically giving a sense of like Isaac had mentioned, like all the edge cases for everything that the user should be able to do with this feature.
Okay. I'll just quickly go over the design documentation again, because this is very important for the cross collaboration between developers and designers. And something that I mentioned before that I showed you the Figma file of is the overall documentation of the color choices that you've used. And these are called design tokens inside Figma, to be exact, and some type of typography system, because there might be a limited amount of typography that you determine to use as a designer for certain apps that you created. It's usually determined between 2 or 3 different types of sizes for fonts for the headers, and there can be different ones for the body and different sizes between different parts of the screens. And it's important for you to kind of determine which works the best for each screens, because if you, even in just the design system part of view, not having too many different sizes for the types are not that clean looking, and it might be very cluttered and not consistent between different screens. So it is important for you to kind of determine which sizes or consistency or even different types of boldness is very important for you to actually point that out and deliver that to the developers. And also, you can't really see the part in the middle or at the end, but that one's actually pulled out from Material UI. And that is an example of an icon library that you may able to utilize for your designs. And I really, really recommend using Material UI, because oftentimes when you kind of pull out a random icon from the web, the developers might have to find similar types of icons from the library that they find on their React base, or having to code themselves, which may take too much time. So I recommend using some types of already made library base that you can just pull out from the icon library. And also it is important because they're already resizable, which means that the size may change depending on the size of the screen. So it's important for you to understand that it works for different types of screens for different users. Yeah, and for the design documentation, this is something that I also mentioned before, showing that these types of arrows shown to developers may be really confusing, and this is not really defined unless they click on the present view, and they may not always be organized. So it is important for you to understand that this type of interaction is not the most ideal way to show the interactive elements between different pages. And it is highly recommended for you to explain to them and have an open communication whenever you get the chance to, before you start showing them on Figma. Because not all developers may want to or have questions to ask you, and you want to prevent that from having that type of miscommunication between them. So I would highly recommend for you to determine whether this type of interaction base is clearly defined to the developers, and make sure that they understand at the same level as you are as a designer. Yeah, and yeah, some things to keep in mind that I mentioned again. Figma has a bunch of different plugin icon libraries that I'll actually show you. Wait. Where's my mouse? I see. Oh, okay. Yeah, so as you can see, you can go to the plugins. And the most common ones that a lot of people do use is like Iconify. Let's click on as an example. And you can just search up like person, for example. And then a lot of designers would just like pull out random icons from this library. But if you choose to use certain icons from this, then developers might not have the exact same icon that you've used in this library, and it can be very confusing for them to see or whether this icon is actually needed. So in order to avoid that type of miscommunication, Material UI also have a plugin called Material Design Icons over here. And I would recommend pulling one of the icons in here. You can also search up on Google to see what icons work the best. And you can just plug in from one of them. It can also change colors, and it's already made as a component. So it's very easy to actually move around and change whenever you need. So I would highly recommend this plugin for Material UI, and this would be the best choice that I would recommend as a designer. And then, yeah, so this question was actually brought up today for me, but one thing that you can also kind of have a hard time kind of considering when you're designing is how do you measure the priority between the client's aesthetic needs and the developer's limited capability of certain UI decisions. This can be, for example, like gradients or the custom nav bar or custom illustration that you've created inside the actual UI aspect. And there can be certain limited scale or limited scope that the developers could do on time and limited constraints that they can do. And they may communicate that to you beforehand. And when you're, for example, doing a user interview, the user may suggest that, oh, this UI decision is necessary and very important. And this is something that a lot of designers have as a dilemma. And I think even though you have certain constraints and limitations, it is very important to understand that you can't just decide on just one section. You have to understand both sides of this issue. And I would recommend having general meetings, including both developers and the clients on hand and all together, and kind of decide and compromise and kind of see what works the best for everyone and try to kind of push through and see whether this design is really serving a purpose. Because even though, let's say you make certain design decisions to be very illustrative and very flashy, a lot of colors, oftentimes this design decision might not be the most necessary and the most best way, because a lot of designers often think that having like a lot of colors and making it all like fancy may be the best design decision, but that's not always the case. And sometimes minimalistic designs and also simple designs work the best. So I would recommend having some sort of compromise between the developers and the clients and see which one works the best. And this is actually very important when you're designing a hi-fi screen. Yeah, and
Yeah, so again, in any development process, things change, things can go wrong. When one half of the team needs to revamp something, the other half might be adversely affected. So again, that can be anything from like scrap features, change designs, a developer realizing that a certain design may not be feasible. Again, like the solution to this on a high level at the end of the day is just going to be communication. Keeping developers in that user feedback loop from the get-go can potentially help with limiting unnecessary overhead from the developer side. But again, there just at some point there's some level of just it's going to be unfortunate at the end of the day. An example of this that actually turned out for the better in some sense last year was on one of Blueprint's projects, Transcend Work, which has like which allows job seekers, which connects job seekers to employers. The developers were working on a nav bar, which allows users to move between screens. The designers had iterated and realized that part of the job seeker view didn't require the nav bar, since there was a map that allowed them to navigate to the specific parts of the app as needed. And so seemingly the nav bar was scrapped. The functionality, of course, of navigation can be moved around and repurposed. But it was kind of like within that process, it's important to kind of realize where exactly can developers be informed about like when the feature that they're working on might be scrapped. At the end of the day, it ended up working out because the navbar was able to be used on the admin side of that app. But again, like it's kind of hard to preemptively think about like coding flexibly for that in that sense. But again, like compartmentalizing your work in a way that you can reuse functionality is part of what it means to be a developer. Oh yeah, and then putting it to practice. So yeah, what makes a hackathon different? So yeah, again, team formation, that's everyone goes through that in a hackathon. You're gonna be working with a smaller team, maybe like one designer, two max, and then a couple of developers. That means less perspectives, and that means a lot more work for everyone involved. The decision making, of course, has to be faster. You have to like have compartmentalized research. You can't have like extensive interviews. Tech stack selection can't take days at a time. You have to take like minutes or hours or like less than an hour, hopefully, since you need to basically jump in ASAP. And so you have your scope of your project has to be like significantly condensed. That informs like the kinds of like the ambition that you can have with your project. The goals and outcome of your project are also different. You're not going to be necessarily like deploying your app for a massive user base at the end of your 24 or 48 hours. We're just trying to get a working demo out to convey your ideas in a hackathon and kind of convey the impact that you want to have with your project. And then finally, of course, on the matter of flexibility and robustness, like there's simply less time to iterate over some of your ideas. So challenges will quickly arise, and you can't be like spending for like for a long-term project, you might be able to spend a sprint or something or a matter of a couple of days fixing things, but the iteration process will be a lot quicker when you only have 2 days. Okay, and yeah, planning to win. So what does that look like? So again, you'll have to pick a hackathon's tracks and understand their respective goals and requirements. So if they have something like health tech or smart cities or anything like that, you want to evaluate the potential impact that your app will have. Because again, like that's what's going to appeal to judges. Considering your user needs and challenges may motivate, like help you to an idea that has that impact. So for the example of like if you have like a track about sustainability or community, you might consider like a food donation app, which I'll elaborate on this example later, that connects like local restaurants to means in which they can give away food in a way that isn't wasteful. And so moving forward, I guess with feature ideation, you don't want to have like 4 to 5 half-baked features that you develop over the course of like, again, a day or two. Focus on like 2 to 3 features that you can like fully flesh out and get through your MVP, your minimum viable product, to make sure that the judges can see something like that actually works. So for example, for a food donation app, you might want like user registration. You might want like a map that connects the users with like restaurants that are part of this program. And then you might also want like a notification system to alert users about like, again, food availability. And then finally, or not finally, but if applicable, a lot of hackathons have sponsor companies that have APIs that if you use them in a meaningful way, you can win prizes. It's not like always a great idea to center your app around this. Rather, I think it's more important to see how you can use those APIs to enhance your app. So for example, if there was like an app with like, if there was an API with some sort of like restaurant review system, for example, like Yelp, for example, that might be useful for a food donation app, connecting users with those restaurants. Do you have something for? Okay. And then, yeah, finally, again, the hurdles will arise again, even more so when your timeline is so condensed. So again, having that joint prototyping and that initial iteration will help in terms of making sure devs and designers are on track and don't have to like change things 18 hours in. Flexibility in roles, by that I mean designers and developers, or developers specifically, I guess, will have their own strengths and weaknesses, and allowing them to sort of go back and forth between features accordingly will allow you to like proceed with your project most efficiently. And again, like open communication channels, nothing new. Use real-time collaboration tools, Figma, VS Code Live Share, that kind of stuff for designing and coding alike can allow you to, again, do things efficiently and like get feedback immediately. Frequent check-ins, since you can't have like an entire internal demo day for a hackathon project, checking in with your designers and your other developers and reviewing each other's work will be important. And again, finally, maintaining centralized documentation. While it might seem like a lot of extra work, having sort of like a center base for everyone to refer back to will, at the end of the day, kind of like streamline your efforts to make sure everything's on track. Yeah. You wanna close?
Thank you. That's all for our workshop today. And yeah. Hopefully that was very helpful for any aspiring project leads inside Blueprint, or even just like the ones who wanted to know both the design and developer process between the whole product development cycle. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.